Ethan Reyes opened his eyes and saw a gray stone ceiling. The cold from the floor seeped through his clothes. A buzz of dozens of voices filled his ears. He was lying on his back in the middle of a huge auditorium with wooden benches. The benches rose in tiers like in an amphitheater. Teenagers in dark robes sat on each one. They were looking down at him. Some were giggling. Some were just staring. Ethan slowly sat up. His head was spinning. The last thing he remembered was the smell of burning plastic, the heat of the fire, and the petri dish in his hands. Line E247. A year and a half of work. He'd almost achieved resistance to the phage. Just 20 more generations. Then the ceiling collapsed. Then nothing. And now there was a rock beneath his back, unfamiliar faces, and a scroll in his right hand. The scroll was warm. Ethan looked at it. A parchment with 3 lines of text. He didn't recognize the letters, but for some reason he understood every word. For some reason he understood. Common slime. Basement rat. Firefly spirit. He read it 3 times. Then he looked at his left palm. 3 tiny marks glowed on his skin. 1 green, 1 gray, 1 white. Something stirred at his feet. A fist-sized lump of translucent jelly. It was rippling, pulsing. A sharp nose poked out from under the bench across from him. A rat. An ordinary gray rat with black eyes. And a spark of green light hovered above his right shoulder. The firefly spirit. The master stood at the lectern in the center of the hall. An elderly man with a weary face and deep wrinkles around his mouth. He held an identical scroll in his hands and read aloud. His voice was even and indifferent. He read Ethan's record just as he had read the others. Common slime, basement rat, firefly spirit. The auditorium erupted. Laughter rippled through the rows like a wave. Some people clapped their hands on the benches in delight. Others repeated the words aloud and choked with laughter. Someone in the back shouted that Reyes could at least have chosen a toad, because at least you can eat a toad. Ethan sat on the floor and stared silently at his palm. The slime at his feet swayed listlessly. The rat was grooming its whiskers. The firefly flickered. Ethan's brain was working. Not the brain that was supposed to panic and scream and ask where he was and what was happening. A different brain, the one that hadn't slept properly in 3 years and had been writing a dissertation and tracking bacterial lineages through 200 generations. A lab brain. Calm, cold, curious. Slime. Essentially a single-celled organism. The simplest biochemistry. A rapid life cycle. Enormous potential for reproduction. A rat. A mammal. A short gestation period, high fertility. A classic model system. A firefly spirit. An unknown nature. But it reacts to something in the air. To mana. So there's a mechanism of interaction. So there's a point of application. So there's selection. Ethan raised his head. The laughter in the auditorium hadn't died down yet. He looked at the rows of faces, at the robes, at the scrolls in strangers' hands, at the creatures sitting next to the other students. Wolves, lizards, small fire and water elementals. Someone in the 3rd row had a small griffin perched on their shoulder. Someone else had a coiled snake with copper-colored scales. All of these were D rank and C rank. Hereditary familiars. The pride of the clans. Ethan looked at his slime, then at the rat, then at the firefly. 3 perfect model organisms, and by all accounts, an infinite amount of time. He smiled, for the first time since his death. The master finished reading the registers and ordered everyone to disperse to their assigned rooms. Ethan stood up. His legs felt like cotton. His body felt like someone else's. He was 19, but his body felt as if he'd just recovered from a serious illness. The slime rolled after him across the floor, leaving a wet trail. The rat darted into his sleeve. The firefly hovered above his head. The academy's corridors were long and echoing. Stone walls, torches in iron brackets, windows overlooking the mountains and the forest. It all looked like a medieval university from a movie, only the air was different. It was thick, rich, as if every breath brought something other than oxygen. Mana. Ethan hadn't known that word an hour ago. Now it sat in his head as if it had always been there. As if someone had uploaded the basic vocabulary of this world directly into his memory. He knew what a summoner was. He knew what a contract was. He knew that ranks went from F to S. He knew that his 3 creatures weren't even F rank. They were lower. They were trash. The room turned out to be small. A bed, a table, a chair, a window. A dorm for low-rank students. Ethan sat down on the bed. The slime climbed onto the table. The rat settled on the windowsill. The firefly hovered in the corner of the ceiling and flickered. Ethan closed his eyes. He was dead. He understood that. A fire in the lab. A short circuit in the autoclave. He didn't make it out in time. He didn't even try to get out. He tried to save the petri dishes. It was stupid. It was totally his style. And now he was here. In a world where people summon creatures and bind them with contracts. In a world where his status is determined by what's written in the scroll. And his scroll contained the most pitiful thing imaginable. Ethan opened his eyes. He stood up. He left the room. He walked down the hallway. He found the kitchen. The kitchen was empty. He picked up a thick notebook with blank pages from the table. He returned to the room. He sat down at the table. He placed the notebook in front of him. And then it happened. An interface appeared before his eyes, translucent, glowing, visible only to him. The letters formed a title. The Journal of Directed Evolution. Ethan froze. He looked at the slime on the table, and he saw it. Not a lump of jelly, not a mindless F-rank creature. He saw a tree. A huge, branching tree of possibilities. Over 40 potential forms. Acid slime, metal slime, a poisonous hunter, a symbiotic healer, an intelligent scout. Each branch glowed with its own color. Each demanded its own conditions. And next to each branch were notes, not just requirements, precise instructions. An acidic environment, 80 generations, food scarcity, the presence of hard shells as targets. This wasn't a magical gift in the usual sense. It was a tool, a breeder's tool, his tool. Ethan shifted his gaze to the rat. The same thing. A tree of possibilities, branches of development, selection criteria. He looked at the firefly, and there too, 3 model organisms, 3 trees, hundreds of possible paths, and a system that tells him exactly what needs to be done to steer evolution in the right direction. Ethan picked up his notebook. He opened the first page and began to write. Line S1, Common Slime. Goal, increase acid resistance and the ability to divide. Necessary conditions, acidic environment, food restriction, strict targets. He wrote for 2 hours, filled 12 pages, 3 evolutionary trees, 3 programs, 3 routes. It had grown dark outside the window. The torch in the hallway had burned out. A rat slept on the windowsill. A firefly illuminated the page with an even green light. The slime pulsed on the table next to the notebook. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He was dead. He was in a foreign world. He had no money, no connections, and no powerful familiar. He had 3 trash creatures and a stolen notebook. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at home. Because he had a lab again. Ethan spent the next 2 weeks in the basement. He found it on the 3rd day, an abandoned room under the east wing of the academy. Supplies had once been stored here, but then the wing was rebuilt, and the basement was forgotten. A low ceiling, damp walls, the smell of mold and earth. Perfect. Ethan dragged a table and chair from an empty lecture hall into the space. He brought a notebook. He hauled a few jars from the kitchen. He got to work. His first task was the slime, line S1. Ethan channeled mana into the slime and felt its metabolism speed up. The slime trembled. It split in 2. 2 became 4. 4 became 8. Within the first hour, Ethan had 32 slimes. He distributed them among the jars. To one jar, he added vinegar from the kitchen, an acidic environment. Into another, he placed pebbles, solid targets. He left the 3rd jar without any food. Selection pressure. After a day, half the slimes in the acid jar had died. The remaining ones were slightly denser, slightly more resilient. Ethan infused the survivors with mana. They split again. He selected those who had survived in the most concentrated acid. He split them again. He selected again. Generation after generation. Under normal conditions, this would have taken years. But mana accelerated the reproductive cycle tenfold. What would have taken 500 years in nature took Ethan only weeks. By the end of the first week, the S1 line had gone through 120 generations. The slimes of this line were no longer translucent. They had taken on a greenish tint. Their outer layer had become denser. They digested rocks. They weren't afraid of acid. They were acid. At the same time, Ethan was working with a rat, line R1. The rat was more complex, a mammal, a longer life cycle, more complex genetics, but the tree of possibilities showed a branch that piqued his interest. The shadow rat. A creature capable of blending into the shadows, moving silently, and seeing in complete darkness. The selection criteria were specific. Darkness, absolute darkness, and a threat. Generation after generation, the rat had to survive in the darkness while evading a predator. The predator was a slime. Ethan released slimes from the acid line into the dark part of the basement where the rats lived. The rats that couldn't hide in the shadows perished. Those that learned to blend into the darkness survived and reproduced. Dual selective pressure. The slimes became better hunters. The rats became better at hiding. Each species pushed the other forward. Ethan recorded every generation in a notebook. Line number, environmental conditions, surviving individuals, observed changes. It was his ritual, his meditation, his way of not going mad in a foreign world. The firefly spirit was the most difficult of all. The creature was immaterial. It didn't divide like a slime. It didn't reproduce like a rat. It simply hung in the air and flickered. The Journal of Directed Evolution showed its tree of possibilities, but the branches were blurred, indistinct, as if the spirit itself weren't fully defined. Ethan decided to leave it alone for now, to observe, gather data. Not every experiment needs to start on the first day. Ethan hardly ever attended classes. He showed up for the mandatory lectures, sat in the back row, and half listened. Summoning theory, clan history, familiar combat tactics. He needed all of that, but not right now. Right now, he needed the lab. The other students didn't notice him. To them, he was a nobody, the weakest student in the history of the class. 3 worthless creatures. It was even boring to make fun of him. He was so far below everyone else that even contempt seemed excessive. That suited Ethan just fine. Invisibility was the best defense for someone conducting forbidden experiments in the basement. But someone did notice him after all. On the 10th day, a girl came down to the basement. Ethan heard footsteps on the stairs and froze. Jars with test tubes stood on the table. The notebook was open. If it was a teacher, he was in trouble. But it wasn't a teacher. A short girl with dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, ink stains on her fingers, glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She was holding a tray of food. She said she'd noticed he'd been skipping lunch for a week. She said she worked in the library and saw everyone who came and went. But he didn't come or go. He just disappeared. She set the tray on the edge of the table. She looked at the jars. She looked at the slimes. She looked at the notebook with the notes. And she didn't ask a single question. She just said she'd bring him food every day if he told her where to find him. Ethan looked at her. Mira Sorensen. He'd already heard her name during roll call. Her record wasn't much better than his. A spiritual butterfly, a creature for decorating salons, useless in battle. People laughed at her too, just more quietly. He told her it was the basement. She nodded and left. The next day she came back, with food and a book. She sat in the corner and read while Ethan worked. She didn't get in the way. She didn't ask questions. She was just there. Ethan didn't know what to make of it. He hadn't had anything like this in his past life. No one ever brought him food to the lab. No one ever sat beside him while he worked. He'd died alone. And part of him still believed that was how it was supposed to be. But Mira came every day. And every day, Ethan caught himself waiting to hear her footsteps on the stairs. On the 12th day, he looked at her moth for the first time through the journal. A moth was perched on her shoulder, pale blue, with wings thinner than paper. Beautiful and utterly useless. That's what everyone thought. Ethan saw the tree of possibilities and froze. 43 branches. One of them glowed brighter than the rest. The library moth archivist. A creature capable of memorizing any text it looked at and relay the information to its owner. A living database. The perfect tool for someone who spends their whole life among books. Ethan jotted down that branch in his notebook. He hadn't said anything to Mira yet. It was too soon. First, he had to finish the first stage with the S-line -1. The exam was in 2 days. An obstacle course with traps, familiar control, a mandatory test for all freshmen. Ethan looked at his slime. Line S1. Generation 280. Greenish, dense, capable of changing shape. Resistant to acid and fire. Able to divide and regenerate. Digests organic matter in seconds. Still F rank according to the official classification. Still a slime. But no longer the same slime that had been wriggling at his feet 2 weeks ago. Ethan smiled. He stroked the slime with his finger. It wrapped itself around his finger and squeezed gently, almost tenderly. 300 generations of hard work. In 2 days, the academy would see the result. The exam arena was located in the center of the academy, an open area the size of a soccer field. Stone bleachers rose on 3 sides. An obstacle course stretched across the entire arena. Steel traps, jets of fire shooting from holes in the floor, a cloud of poisonous gas in an enclosed section, moving stone blocks, and, at the very end, a target the familiar was supposed to hit. The students entered one at a time. The first released a D-rank wolf. The gray beast raced through the course in a minute and a half. It leaped over the traps, dodged the fire, held its breath in the gas section, smashed the target with its paw. The stands clapped politely. The second released a fire elemental. It moved even faster. The fire traps didn't touch it. The third student released a small griffin. It simply flew over most of the obstacles from above. The examining magistrate made a note in the logbook. The griffin received the highest score. Name after name, creature after creature. D ranks, C ranks. 1 B rank. The heir to a mid-tier clan summoned a young basilisk, which cleared the course without even picking up speed. Stone melted under its gaze. The stands roared. Then they called out the name of Ethan Reyes. The laughter began even before he stepped into the arena. Everyone knew his record. Slime, rat, firefly, trash bag. Ethan descended the steps into the arena. He was calm. His hands didn't tremble. In his head was that same lab voice. Test the hypothesis. Observe the result. Record the data. He placed his hand on the ground. The slime oozed out of his sleeve and froze in front of the first obstacle. A steel trap. Its teeth glinted in sunlight. The slime moved forward. It approached the trap and flattened itself into a thin pancake. So thin that it became almost transparent. It seeped between the trap's teeth like water through a grate. It reformed on the other side. It resumed its original shape. Someone in the stands stopped laughing. The second trap. A jet of fire. Flames shot up from the floor. The heat was intense enough to singe a wolf's fur. The slime didn't back down. It split apart. 1 became 8. 7 little slimes rushed forward, taking the fire upon themselves. They burned. They shrank. They evaporated. 7 decoys. The 8th one slid along the wall past the flames. It ended up on the other side and began to grow. The moss on the arena walls vanished in seconds. The slime devoured the organic matter, regaining its lost mass. 10 seconds later, it was back to its original size. The stands fell silent. The third trap. A sealed section filled with poisonous gas. A yellow-green cloud filled the chamber. The wolves here held their breath and ran. The griffins refused to enter. The elementals passed through but lost their form. The slime entered the cloud. It didn't hold its breath. He had no lungs. He absorbed the gas. He absorbed it with his entire body surface. The greenish tint grew brighter, more intense, more toxic. The slime passed through the chamber and found himself in front of the target. A wooden shield with a circle painted on it. The slime froze for a second. It contracted and spat out a concentrated drop of processed poison. The drop pierced right through the target. The wood around the hole sizzled and turned black. The acid burned a hole the size of a fist. The silence in the stands was absolute. The examiner stood with his mouth agape. The quill in his hand didn't move. Someone in the third row whispered a question. That's an F rank. Ethan stood down in the arena. The slime returned to him and climbed onto his palm. Ethan bowed politely to the stands. Inside, his mind was working as usual. Generation 340, line S1. Results exceed projections. Note, resistance to thermal exposure. Note, ability to concentrate toxins. Note, rate of mass regeneration through organic matter absorption. Continue the line. He climbed the steps back up to the stands. He sat down in his seat in the last row. Mira was sitting 2 rows below him. She turned around and looked at him. Her eyes were wide open. She didn't say anything. She just stared. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. After the exam, the examiner approached him. He asked how long Ethan had had that slime. Ethan replied, 2 weeks. The examiner didn't believe him. He asked where he'd gotten a creature of that level. Ethan replied that it was the very same slime from his registry, an ordinary one. The examiner was silent for a long time. Then he wrote down something in his logbook and walked away without looking back. By evening, the whole academy was talking about Ethan. Not loudly, in whispers, in the hallways, in the dining hall, in the dorms. The slime completed the obstacle course. The slime hit the target with acid. An F-rank slime did what a D-rank wolf couldn't. Some said it was a trick. Others said the slime had been swapped out. Some said Ethan had found a rare mutant. No one told the truth, because the truth was too strange. The truth lay in the notebook in the basement. In 340 generations of selective breeding. In the jars of acid, the stones, the moss, and the ambient pressure. But no one knew that. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his basement. The notebook lay on the table. The slime pulsed in the jar. Rats rustled in a dark corner. A firefly flickered beneath the ceiling. Mira came in as usual, with food and a book. She sat down across from him. She set down the tray, and for the first time in all these days, she asked a question. She asked how he'd done it. Ethan looked at her. He looked at the moth on her shoulder. Blue wings, thinner than paper. A useless creature, meant only to decorate salons. 43 branches of possibility. He opened his notebook to a blank page. He wrote at the top, Line M1, Spiritual Moth, Contractor, Mira Sorensen. And he began to tell her. Ethan talked to Mira all night. Not about magic, about biology, about how natural selection works, about how every creature is not a single point, but a tree, and every branch of that tree can lead to something new if the right conditions are created. Mira listened without interrupting. The moth on her shoulder folded its wings and listened too, or so it seemed. Ethan explained that he saw the potential in every creature, that her butterfly wasn't useless, that within it lay a branch leading to a creature capable of memorizing any text. Mira was silent for a long time. Then she said that her parents had been explorers. They'd died on an expedition when she was 12. They believed that within weak creatures lay a power that no one seeks. They were ridiculed for it. Then they set out on an expedition to the eastern borders and never returned. Mira fell silent. The butterfly on her shoulder spread its wings and folded them back again. Ethan didn't tell her that everything would be all right. He didn't like empty promises. Instead, he turned the notebook toward her. He pointed a branch. Library, moth archivist. Selection criteria. Constant contact with texts. Saturation with mana of a specific spectrum. Stimulation through information overload. Time. Approximately half a year on an accelerated cycle. He said he needed her help. It wasn't him who needed her, the moth needed her. Because this branch only works with a contractor who lives among texts himself. The moth evolves into whatever his host needs, and Mira needs memory. Mira nodded. The next day, she brought the first stack of books down to the basement. The month passed quickly. Ethan worked 18 hours a day. The S1 line had reached its 400th generation. The slimes in this line could now change their density from liquid to almost rock hard. They digested metal. They communicated with each other through chemical signals. They were far beyond what the world considered possible for a slime. The R1 line yielded its first result. A rat from the 42nd generation of the shadow branch completely merged with the shadow for the first time. Ethan stood in a dark corner of the basement and watched as the rat vanished. It didn't become invisible. It actually vanished. Its body entered the shadow as if into water. 3 seconds later, it emerged from the shadow in another corner. Ethan jotted it down in his notebook. Line R1, Generation 42. First stable shadow transition. Duration of immersion, 3 seconds. Transition distance, 4 meters. Continue selection. Increase distance. Line M1 with Mira's moth had only just begun. Every evening, Mira sat in the basement and read. The moth sat on the open pages. Ethan fed it mana once a day. So far, there had been no changes, but the journal showed that the process was underway. Slowly, surely. Rumors about Ethan spread throughout the academy and beyond. Students from other streams came to see him in the dining hall. He ate quickly and left. He didn't talk. He didn't answer questions. One of the older students tried to follow him to see where he'd disappeared to after class. Ethan noticed he was being followed on the second day. He released a shadow rat. The rat led the pursuer to another wing of the building along a false trail. Ethan calmly went down to the basement. But not everyone reacted to him with mere curiosity. In the fourth week, Darius Quan approached him. He was the heir to a middle-ranking clan. His familiar was a C-rank ice wolf, a beautiful beast, white fur, blue eyes, fangs as long as a palm. Darius was tall, broad-shouldered, with the face of a man accustomed to everyone around him nodding in agreement. He approached Ethan in the hallway after a lecture. He said he'd seen his slime during the exam. He said it was impressive. Then he said he wanted to buy the slime. He named a price. Ethan wasn't very familiar with the local currency, but judging by the reactions of the students around him, he realized it was a large sum. He refused. Darius smiled. He said he'd think about it some more. He said the offer would remain open. He left, but his eyes weren't smiling. 3 days later, Ethan stepped into his first clan duel, not of his own volition. The academy system required mandatory duels between students to determine ranks within the class. The draw pitted him against Darius Quan, and Ethan didn't believe in coincidences. The arena was the same. The stands were fuller. Rumors of the slime had drawn spectators. Darius stepped out first. An ice wolf stood beside him. Its fur was standing on end. Steam rose from its mouth. The temperature around the wolf dropped by several degrees. S-rank, a creature bred by the Quan clan for 6 generations. Strong, fast, trained to kill. Ethan entered second. He set a jar on the ground. He opened the lid. Slime oozed out. The stands buzzed. Darius smirked. He said he'd hoped to see something other than slime. The master judge gave the signal. The wolf attacked first. It was fast. Very fast. A white flash darted across the arena. Its jaws snapped open. Its fangs struck the slime and passed right through it. The slime parted around the fangs like water around a rock. The wolf sank its teeth into emptiness. Its jaws snapped. Nothing. The slime was already behind it. The wolf spun around. It swiped with its paw. Its claws passed right through the slime's body. The slime split. It became 2. 2 became 4. The wolf growled and thrashed about. Every strike passed right through the goo. Every bite bit into thin air. The slimes clung to his paws. The wolf jerked. He tried to shake them off. He couldn't. The slimes were crawling up his legs. A thin layer of jelly covered its fur. The wolf whimpered. Acid. Not strong, not lethal. Ethan didn't want to cause pain. He wanted to prove a point. The slimes secreted a weak acid that irritated the wolf's skin beneath its fur. Itching. Burning. The wolf began rolling on the ground, trying to scrape the slime off itself. Darius turned pale. He shouted a command. The wolf blew an icy breath. A chill swept through the arena. The slimes froze. For a second. Then they cracked, thawed, reformed. 400 generations of hardening. Acid, fire, cold. These slimes had survived it all. The wolf stood in the middle of the arena, caked in green slime. He whimpered. He trembled. Not from the cold. Because for the first time in his life, he couldn't strike his enemy. Darius raised his hand. He gave up. The stands fell silent. Then they erupted, not with laughter, but with noise, shouts, and arguments. An F rank had defeated a C rank. A slime had defeated the ice wolf. It was impossible. Yet it had happened. Ethan took the slime. He bowed. He left. Mira was waiting for him in the hallway. She didn't say anything. She just walked beside him, down to the basement, just like every day. Ethan sat down at the table. He opened his notebook. He wrote down the results. Line S1, Generation 408, Combat Deployment. Victory over an S-rank ice familiar. Minimal losses. Full recovery. Recommendation, continue the line. He closed the notebook. Mira was sitting across from him with a book. The moth on her shoulder glowed a little brighter than yesterday. Ethan noticed. He made a note of it. After the duel with Darius, Ethan's life changed. His invisibility was over. Now people recognized him in the hallways. Now they approached him. Now his name was spoken not with mockery, but with a questioning tone. Who was he? Where had he come from? How did his slime do what it did? It annoyed Ethan. The attention interfered with his work. He began appearing in common areas only early in the morning and late at night. He spent the rest of his time in the basement. But the basement, too, was no longer safe. A week after the duel, 2 guys came to see him. He didn't know their names. They were upperclassmen. One was tall, with a narrow face. The other was stocky, with a snake tattoo on his neck. They walked down the stairs without hiding. They stood in the doorway. The tall one surveyed the basement. Jars on the table, a notebook, slimes in containers, rats in the corner. He said he'd come with an offer from people who valued talent. He said that certain people were willing to provide Ethan with a real laboratory, resources, protection, rare catalysts that he couldn't find on his own. In return, they wanted access to his bloodlines. Not all of them, just some. And, of course, loyalty. Ethan asked who they were from. The tall man smiled and said they were from the Wayland clan. Wayland. Ethan had heard that name in lectures. The oldest dynasty of dragon contractors. One of the 7 great families of Airhold. Their head kept an ancient golden dragon. Their heirs possessed S-rank creatures from birth. They were the pinnacle of what this world considered power. Ethan refused. Polite, calm. He said he worked alone and had no plans to change that. The tall man stopped smiling. He said Ethan should think it over. He said the Wayland clan wasn't used to being turned down. They left. Ethan sat motionless for a minute. Then he stood up. He moved the jars with the lines to the farthest corner of the basement. He released the shadow rats. 3 of them. Generation 56. They could remain in the shadows for up to 10 seconds and move a distance of up to 8 meters. He stationed them to guard the entrance. If anyone came down the stairs, the rats would warn him. That wasn't enough. Ethan understood. 3 rats wouldn't stop a serious summoner, but he had no other options yet. He needed time. Time. 2 days later, another visitor came to see him. But this one was different. Ethan was sitting at the table, entering data into his notebook, when he heard footsteps. Light. Quick. The rats didn't sound the alarm. That meant the person wasn't hostile. A girl was standing in the doorway. Dark-skinned, thin, short black hair, quick, dark eyes that scanned the entire basement in a second and noted every exit. The eyes of someone accustomed to assessing escape routes. Julia Moreno. Ethan knew her. She'd been admitted on a scholarship for gifted students from the lower classes. The only one in her cohort without clan affiliation. Her record was even worse than Ethan's. A basement rat. 1. Not even 3 creatures. 1 rat. She said she hadn't come to talk. She said she'd seen his duel. She said she didn't care how he did it. She needed to know one thing. Could he do something about her rat? Because if not, she had no business being at this academy. In 6 months, her scholarship would be reviewed. If she didn't show results, they'd send her back out onto the streets. and she'd already been on the streets, and she had no intention of going back. Ethan looked at her. Then he looked at the rat at her feet. Small, gray, an ordinary basement rat, exactly like the one he'd had on his first day. He opened the journal. The tree of possibilities unfolded before his eyes. He searched for a specific branch. He found it. Shadow beast burglar, a creature that sees in the dark, that senses traps, capable of picking locks by mimicking its master's movements. The perfect partner for someone who grew up on the streets. For someone who knows every lock and every crack. Ethan turned the notebook toward her. He showed her the branch. He explained, not everything, enough for her to understand. Her rat could become something that didn't exist in this world, but it would take time, and she'd have to work with him every day. Training in the dark, exercises to improve coordination between her and the rat. The rat would learn to mimic her movements, to open what she opens, to see what she sees. Julia looked at him in silence. Then she said she didn't have the money to pay him. Ethan replied that he didn't take money. He took data. Every evening she would record her observations of the rat, its behavior, its reactions, changes. That was his payment. Julia smirked. She said he was strange. Then she sat down on the floor, crossing her legs, and said she'd start right away. Ethan looked at her, then at Mira, who was sitting in her corner with a book and a moth. Mira smiled at him, quietly, barely noticeably. 2 girls, 2 paths, 2 broken stories that had found their way to him in the basement because they had nowhere else to go. Ethan didn't know what to do with this feeling. In his past life, he'd worked alone. He'd eaten alone. He died alone. No one ever came to his lab with food. No one ever sat on the floor and said they'd start right away. He opened a blank page in his notebook. He wrote at the top, Line R2, Basement Rat, Contractor, Julia Moreno, Target Form, Shadow Beastbreaker. And he began to work. A week later, the 3rd one arrived. Ethan was alone in the basement. Mira had gone to the library. Julia was training with the rat in the dark hallway around the corner. It was late, past midnight. The footsteps on the stairs were almost silent. The guard rats sounded the alarm. Not an alarm, just caution. Someone was walking slowly and trying not to make a sound. Ethan put away his notebook. He stood up. He turned toward the door. A girl in an expensive robe entered the basement. Her back was straight. Her posture was perfect. Her light hair was pulled back into a simple style. Her face was beautiful and completely expressionless. Eyes that looked at the world as if through glass. Ethan recognized the crest on the robe. A golden dragon on a black field. Wayland. Eleanor Wayland, the youngest daughter. He froze. A week ago, emissaries from her clan had offered him a deal. He had refused. Now the clan's daughter was standing in his basement in the middle of the night. This could be a second round of negotiations. Or a trap. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She didn't come in. She didn't sit down. Her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She was silent for a full minute. Ethan waited. Then she spoke, quietly, almost a whisper. She said she hadn't come on behalf of the clan, that the clan didn't know she was here, that if they found out, she'd be punished. She said she had a dragon, a young dragon she'd been given when she was 12, a clan familiar, the pride of the family. She said his wings had been clipped. The clan clips the wings of young dragons to ensure obedience, so they won't fly away, so they'll obey, so they'll stay in their stalls. She said her dragon hadn't been able to fly since birth, that he'd never fully spread his wings, that he's unhappy, and she's seen it every day since she was 12.
and no one in the clan listens to the girl when she says the dragon is suffering. She fell silent. Then she looked up. She looked straight at Ethan, and she said one sentence. She asked him to help the dragon become his true self,
even if the clan killed her afterward. Ethan was silent. He looked at her and saw a person standing on the edge. Someone who had come to a stranger in the middle of the night because her own people had long since stopped listening. He didn't make any promises. He didn't try to comfort her. He said he wanted to see the dragon. Eleanor nodded. She said she'd bring it to the stables tomorrow night. She turned and left. Her footsteps faded on the stairs. Ethan sat down at the table. He opened his notebook. He wrote on a blank page. Line D1. Dragon. Wayland clan. Contractor. Eleanor Wayland. Target form. Unknown. Goal. Freedom. He put a period. He looked at the words. Freedom. It wasn't a scientific definition. It wasn't a selection criterion. It was something else. Something that wasn't in his old lab journals. Ethan closed the notebook. A firefly flickered above his head. A rat slept on the windowsill. Slime pulsed in a jar. 3 trash creatures. 2 girls who came every day, and 1 who came at night with a request to save a dragon. A month ago, he'd woken up on a stone floor and was a nobody. Now he had a lab. He had his lines. He had data. And there were people who, for some reason, had decided he could be trusted. Ethan didn't know if he deserved that trust. He knew only one thing. He wouldn't let them down. In his past life, he had let only himself down. In this one, he was going to do better. The following night, Eleanor led him to the stables. The Wayland clan's stables were located in a separate wing of the academy, behind heavy oak doors. Beyond 2 guards with D-rank familiars. Eleanor led Ethan through a side entrance, a narrow corridor for the servants. It smelled of hay and something hot, metal and smoke. The scent of a dragon. They passed 3 empty stalls. The 4th was locked with 2 bolts. Eleanor pushed them aside. Her hands were shaking. The door opened. The stall was the size of a small room. A stone floor, stone walls, not a single window. A dragon lay in the corner. Ethan had seen dragons in pictures in library books. Majestic creatures with a wingspan of 20 meters, fire-breathing, scales harder than steel, kings of the sky. This dragon was different. Young, about the size of a large dog. Its dark blue scales had faded and were mottled with gray spots. Its eyes were cloudy. And its wings. Ethan looked at the wings and something tightened in his chest. The membranes had been cut, not torn, neatly trimmed, surgically, systematically. Every time they grew back, they were cut again. Scars from repeated cuts were visible along the edges of the membranes. The dragon raised its head. It looked at Eleanor. Its eyes changed. The cloudiness was gone. Something alive appeared. He recognized her. Eleanor dropped to her knees and pressed her palm against his snout. The dragon closed his eyes. Ethan opened the journal. The dragon's tree of possibilities unfolded before him, and he froze. It wasn't a tree. It was a stump. Dozens of branches were dead, gray lines leading nowhere. Generations of clan selective breeding had pruned away his potential just as they had clipped his wings. For centuries, the Wayland clan had guided the dragons along a single narrow branch. Strength, obedience, fire-breathing. Everything else was cut away as superfluous. The freedom to fly was superfluous. Independent thought was superfluous.
Everything that made a dragon was superfluous. But Ethan saw what no one else had seen in this world. Among the dead branches, there was one that was alive,
delicate, almost imperceptible. The branch led to a form that the journal called the free-winged one, a dragon that flies, one that chooses where to fly on its own. The selection criteria were complex: restoration of the membranes through enhanced regeneration, stimulation of atrophied wing muscles, rewiring of the neural pathways responsible for flight. This was no ordinary selection process spanning generations. A dragon lives for hundreds of years. It does not have a rapid reproductive cycle. A different approach was needed here. Directed evolution within a single individual. Slow, meticulous, mana channeled precisely into specific tissues. Ethan estimated the time frame. 1.5 years, at a minimum. He turned to Eleanor. He told her he could help. He told her it would take a very long time, and that he would need access to the dragon every night. Eleanor nodded. She said she'd figure something out. Ethan placed his hand on the dragon's scale. It was warm. The dragon flinched. It opened its eyes. It looked at Ethan, not with hostility, with something else, with cautious curiosity. Ethan directed a thin stream of mana into the wing's membranes. Not much. A drop, a pinpoint application. Stimulation of the cells at the edges of the scar tissue. Regeneration began. The dragon blinked. It spread its wing, not fully, just 1/3 of the way. But for the first time in a long while, the membrane didn't tighten with pain. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth. Ethan withdrew his hand. He made a mental note. Session 1. Positive response. The scar tissue is responding to mana stimulation. Prognosis? Cautiously optimistic. They walked back down the same corridor. Eleanor walked in silence. At the exit, she stopped. She turned to him and said 2 words. "Thank you, Reyes." Ethan nodded. He returned to the basement. It was 3 a.m. Mira was asleep at the table, her head resting on an open book. A moth sat on her hair, glowing softly. Ethan didn't wake her. He draped his jacket over her shoulders. He sat down at the table. He opened his notebook and worked until dawn. The next 2 months were the most intense of his new life. He was mapping out the paths of the slimes and rats. At night, he visited the dragon. Every evening he worked with Mira on the moth and with Julia on her rat. He slept for 3 hours, sometimes 2. Mira was the first to notice. She came in the morning with breakfast and saw that he was sitting at the table in the same position she had left the night before. She set the tray down in front of him. He didn't react. She took his hand. His fingers were ice cold. She said his name. He looked up. His eyes were red. The circles under his eyes were black. She told him he'd kill himself if he kept this up. Ethan replied that he knew his limits. Mira replied that she didn't know. That in his past life, he'd thought he knew too. And he'd died in a fire because he'd saved the petri dishes instead of himself. Ethan froze. He'd never told anyone about his past life. Mira shook her head. She said he talks in his sleep, sometimes, when he falls asleep at the table. He talks about some lines and generations and an autoclave, and that he needs 20 more generations. She doesn't understand all the words, but she gets the gist. He was alone, and he died. And now he's repeating the same thing. Ethan was silent. Mira sat across from him. The moth on her shoulder spread its wings. They were slightly wider than a month ago, slightly brighter. The process was underway. Ethan looked at her, at the ink stains on her fingers, at the book within reach, at the moth, at the tray of food she'd brought, every day, without fail.
He took a piece of bread from the tray, took a bite. Mira smiled. It was a silent agreement. He would eat, she would bring it. Neither of them would speak of it aloud. By the end of the second month, Julia's R2 line yielded its first result. The rat had learned to open simple latches, not with its teeth, with its paws, by mimicking Julia's movements. Julia stood in front of a locked door and slowly turned an imaginary key. The rat sat nearby and watched. Then it approached the lock, inserted a claw, turned it. Click. Open. Julia laughed. The first time with Ethan. A loud, sharp laugh. She picked up the rat and pressed it to her cheek. The rat squeaked. Julia said she'd never had anything that couldn't be taken away from her. Ethan said nothing. He jotted it down in his notebook. By the third month, everything had changed. Hannah Park burst into his life like a storm. She didn't come to the basement, she came to the arena, the second mandatory tournament of the stream. Ethan was standing by the wall waiting for his turn when he saw her. Short, back straight as a taut string, black hair down to her shoulders, a sharp, beautiful, and angry face. A single contract mark glowed on her arm. A little fox sat at her feet, small, red, with a single tail. She was challenged to a duel by the heir of a mid-tier clan. His familiar was a C-rank fire lizard. The duel lasted 20 seconds. The lizard spat out a jet of fire. Lee Kitten dodged it, quickly, very quickly. But it was too small, too weak. A second jet of fire struck the floor next to the little fox. Hannah recalled him. The little fox was unharmed, but the battle was lost. The heir smirked and said something about a pathetic tale. Hannah stood with her back straight and looked at him. She didn't lower her gaze, she didn't look away. But Ethan could see the knuckles of her clenched fists turn white. He opened the journal and looked at the fox cub. The tree of possibilities unfolded, and Ethan held his breath. It was a massive tree, hundreds of branches. Dozens of them led to forms he couldn't even dream of. The nine-tailed Kumikul, the legend of the Pak clan, an S-rank and higher, capable of shifting form, creating illusions, controlling fire and shadow simultaneously. The Pak clan was once great. Their foxes were among the continent's strongest familiars. But 400 years ago, the clan took a wrong turn. Ethan saw it in the tree. He saw the point of divergence. He saw where they began breeding for submissiveness instead of strength, where they pruned away the branches leading to higher forms because they feared the fox would become too independent. The same mistake the Violins made. The same mistake made by every clan in this world. The fear that your creature will become stronger than you. Ethan memorized every branch, every condition, every path. After the tournament, he found Hannah. She was sitting on the balcony of the east wing, alone. A fox cub was curled up on her lap. The sun was setting. Ethan walked over and sat down beside her, not too close. He said nothing. Hannah didn't look at him. She said that if he'd come to feel sorry for her, he could leave. Ethan replied that he hadn't come to feel sorry for her, that he'd looked at her fox cub, that the Kumiho line had monstrous potential, that her clan had been great, and that he could see a way back. Hannah turned to face him. Her eyes were shining. She asked what he was carrying. Ethan took out a notebook. He opened it to the page he'd filled out after the tournament. He showed it to her. The Pak clan branch. The point of divergence 400 years ago. The path back. The conditions. Time frame, 2 years. All 9 tails. Not because he was a great summoner, but because her clan had been great, and he could see that. Hannah looked at the notebook, then at him, then back at the notebook. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said nothing. The fox cub on her lap raised its head and looked at Ethan. One tail swayed from side to side. Hannah stood up. She pressed the notebook to her chest. She said that if he was lying, she'd kill him herself. Ethan replied that he wasn't lying. She nodded. She turned and left. She stopped at the doorway. Without turning around, she said she'd come to his basement tomorrow, and that it had better be clean. Ethan watched her leave. The little fox turned over her shoulder and looked at him again. Ethan went back to the basement. He sat down at the table. He opened his notebook to a blank page. Line K1. Fox Cub Kumiko. Contractor. Hana Park. Target form. 9-tailed. 4 contractors. 4 lines. Slime, rat, moth, fox cub, dragon, and him. A single scientist with a stolen notebook and 3 hours of sleep. He should have felt that this was too much, that he couldn't handle it, that he was just a dead grad student from another world. Instead, he felt the mana pulsing in his palms. He heard the rats rustling in the darkness, how a firefly flickered above his head. He was back in the lab, and this time, he wasn't alone. The 4th month became Hana's month. She came to the basement the day after their conversation on the balcony. She looked around the room. She said it stank in there. She said the rats were disgusting. She said the table was wobbly. Then she sat down on the floor next to Julia. She placed the fox cub on her lap, and she said she was ready. Working with the fox cub required a different approach. Kumiko weren't like slimes. They didn't split. They didn't reproduce quickly. Their evolution took place through their tails. Each tail was a new level, a new stage of power, and each one required its own conditions. The fox cub already had its first tail. For the second, the journal laid out clear requirements. Fire tempering. The fox cub had to learn not just to dodge the fire, but to pass through it, to absorb it, to make it a part of himself. Ethan set up a training regimen. Every evening, he released acid-line slimes. They gave off heat as they digested organic matter, not fire, but heat. The fox cub had to sit in the center of a circle of slimes, get used to the warmth, then to the heat, then to the temperature at which ordinary fur catches fire. Hana sat right beside him every second. She didn't leave. She didn't look away. When the fox cub whimpered, she clenched her fists, but didn't stop the process. She understood. Ethan could see it in her eyes. She knew what it meant to endure for the sake of a goal. She'd been doing it her whole life. Meanwhile, work continued on the other lines. The S1 line had crossed the threshold of the 500th generation. The slimes in this branch were already unrecognizable. Dense, fast, capable of communicating via chemical signals over distances of up to 30 meters. They functioned as a single organism. If one detected food, the others knew about it within seconds. If one was in danger, the others formed a protective wall. Ethan had derived 3 sublines from the main line. S1A, acid assault, maximum concentration of acid secretion. S1B, shield, surface density approaching that of rubber, capable of forming a barrier when several individuals merge. S1C, scout, smallest size, almost transparent, capable of penetrating gaps 2 millimeters wide. 3 subspecies from a single trash slime. Ethan looked at them and thought about his dissertation, about E. coli E247, about how, over 200 generations, it's possible to breed a strain from a harmless bacterium that does impossible things. The principle is the same. The scale is different. The R1 line of shadow rats had reached its 100th generation. The shadow transition had become stable. 20 seconds in the shadows, a distance of 15 meters. The rats could carry small objects with them into the shadows. They were ideal scouts. Ethan sent them out on patrol every night. They scoured the academy's corridors and returned with information. Who was walking around at night? Who was whispering? Who was watching the basement? The information was alarming. Someone was watching the basement, Not openly, but from a distance.
One of the upperclassmen regularly walked past the east wing after midnight. The shadow rats had spotted the same person 4 times that week. Ethan didn't know who it was, but he knew time was running out. Mira's moth was changing, slowly but surely. Its wings had grown wider. The color had shifted from pale blue to a deep blue with silver veins. Every evening, Mira read in the basement while the moth perched on the pages. Ethan noticed the first sign toward the end of the 4th month. Mira was reading a book on the history of the clan wars. She closed it, set it aside. And an hour later, in a conversation with Julia, she quoted a paragraph from the middle of the book, word for word. She froze. She looked at the moth. The moth was perched on her shoulder, shimmering. Mira whispered that she didn't remember that page, that she had just skimmed past it. But the moth remembered, and it had relayed it to her. Ethan made a note in his notebook. Line M1, month 4. First instance of information transfer from a familiar to a contractor. Volume, 1 paragraph. Accuracy, absolute. Forecast. The process is moving faster than expected. The basement has become cramped. 4 girls, dozens of creatures. Jars, notebooks, books, food. Julia and Hannah argued every day. Julia thought Hannah was a nuisance. Hannah thought Julia was vulgar. Mira sat quietly in the corner and pretended not to hear. Eleanor only came at night. She would sit off to the side. She would say nothing. She would watch. Sometimes she helped Mira clean up after the experiments. She was the only one besides Ethan who wasn't asleep. Ethan was getting used to it. It was strange. He had lived alone in the lab for 3 years. Silence and order and only the hum of the centrifuge. Now there were people around him. Noise, arguments, Julia's laughter, Eleanor's silence, Hannah's grumbling, Mira's quiet muttering over her book. He caught himself smiling when he heard their voices on the stairs. It frightened him. In his past life, he didn't need anyone. He told himself he didn't need anyone. And he died alone in a burning lab. And at the very last moment, he thought not of people, but of petri dishes. Maybe that was honest. Maybe that was the truth. Or maybe it was a lie he'd repeated for so long that he'd come to believe it. He didn't know. But every evening, when Mira set a tray of food in front of him, when Julia sat on the floor with her legs crossed and started arguing with a rat that wouldn't open a new type of lock, when Hannah sat silently next to the fox cub and watched it get used to the heat, when Eleanor appeared in the doorway after midnight, quiet as a shadow. Every evening he felt the lie cracking. Toward the end of the 4th month, what Ethan had been waiting for and fearing happened. Hannah's fox cub grew a second tail. It happened at night. Hannah sat next to the fox cub in the center of a circle of slimes. The heat was at its peak. The fox cub was trembling. Hannah held him by the scruff of his neck. She wouldn't let it back. Her hand was burning. Her skin was reddening. She wouldn't let go. Ethan watched and counted the seconds. The cub's body temperature was rising. Mana pulsed through his body. The log showed that the branch was active, that the transition point was near, that one more push was needed. Ethan channeled his mana, not into the fox cub, but into the bond between Hannah and the fox cub, into the contractual thread that connected them. The thread flared. Hannah cried out. The fox cub dropped its head, and a second tail grew. Not slowly, instantly, like a tongue of flame. The red fur flared with gold. 2 tails unfurled behind the kitsune's back. The heat in the room vanished. The kitsune absorbed it all. Hannah sat on the floor, staring at her familiar. 2 tails. for the first time in 200 years in the Park clan. She didn't cry. She pressed the fox cub to her chest and closed her eyes. Her lips trembled. Ethan silently jotted it down in his notebook. Line K1, month 4, second tale. Success. The 5th month brought the final member of the team. So-yeon Che taught familiar control in the Department of Combat Disciplines. Ethan had seen her in lectures. Calm, beautiful, always with a cup of tea. Her hair tied back in a simple bun. She spoke softly, yet loud enough for the entire audience to hear. She was the only instructor who hadn't laughed at his register on the first day. She looked at him then with an expression he couldn't read. Not pity, not contempt. Something else. Interest. In the 5th month, she asked him to stay after class. The lecture hall had emptied. So-yeon sat behind the lectern. The tea was growing cold in her cup. She said she'd been watching him since day 1, that she'd seen the exam with the slime. She'd seen the duel with Kwan. She'd seen how the creatures around him changed. She said she knew about the basement. Ethan tensed. She raised her hand. She said she wasn't going to turn him in. She said she'd long ago understood what he was now proving. The ranking system isn't science. It's a cult. Clan lineages aren't strength. It's inbreeding. The entire world of summoners is built on a mistake. On the belief that a creature is strong because its ancestors were strong. She'd known this for years. And for years, she'd kept silent. Because speaking out meant losing her position, her protection, and the chance to change things from the inside. She fell silent, took a sip of tea. Then she said she wanted to help, not as a mentor, as an ally. She could write official reports. Student Reyes's genetic lines are within the norm, a common mutation, nothing unusual. A cover. She could give him access to the restricted archives, old breeding records that the clans keep under lock and key. Records that prove that, long ago, summoners used to crossbreed creatures of different classes. Before the clans declared it heresy. Before everyone forgot that it was even possible. Ethan listened and understood. This woman was risking everything. Her career, her safety, her reputation, for an idea she knew was right, but couldn't prove on her own. He recognized that feeling. He'd lived with it himself for 3 years in the lab. When you see what can be done, but can't do it because you're alone. He said he accepted it. So-yeon nodded. She finished her tea. She said the restricted archive was in the library basement. She had the key. She'd give it to Mira. Mira worked at the library and didn't need an excuse to be there. Ethan thanked her. So-yeon looked at him for a long time. Then she said he reminded her of someone. Someone from the old records. Someone who had long ago tried to do the same thing. She didn't say who. She stood up, took her cup, left. Ethan stood in the empty auditorium and thought. 6 people, 5 lines, 1 basement. This wasn't an experiment anymore. It was a movement. Small, secret, but a movement nonetheless. Access to the Forbidden Archive had changed everything. Mira brought the first records 2 days later. Yellowed scrolls, faded ink, records 300 and 400 years old. Ethan read them and felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. These records were lab journals. Someone in this world hundreds of years ago had been doing the same thing he was. Crossbreeding creatures of different classes, creating hybrids, conducting targeted breeding. And the results were astonishing. The hybrid lines outperformed the purebreds in every respect. Endurance, adaptability, disease resistance, ability to evolve further. The purebred lines were dead ends. Beautiful, powerful dead ends. But dead ends nonetheless. The records ended abruptly.
The last scroll ended mid-sentence, as if the author had been stopped, or had stopped of his own accord. Ethan asked Miriam if she knew who had written it. Mira shook her head. The author's name had been crossed out, erased, destroyed. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that name vanished from history. Ethan placed the scrolls on the table. He looked at his notebook, at the hundreds of pages of his own notes, at the trees of evolution, at the lines and sublines and branches and dead ends. He was doing the same thing, and someone before him had done the same thing, and that someone had been erased. He thought about it. Then he opened his notebook and continued working. There was no time for fear. The first assassination attempt took place in the 6th month. Ethan was returning from the dragon stall at 3 a.m. The corridor was empty and dark. Shadow rats scurried ahead. One of them gave a signal. It froze. His hair stood on end. Ethan stopped. Silence. Then movement. To the right. A man emerged from behind a column. A second one followed. Both were masked. Both had familiars. One released a C-rank chain viper. The snake slithered across the floor, its fangs bared. Venom dripped onto the stones. The second released a stone elemental, a heavy creature made of rough granite. 2 C-rank familiars against Ethan, who had no combat creatures, no preparation, no plan. Exactly what he'd feared. If caught in the middle of the night without his lab and without prepared lines, he was defenseless. But he had his rats. Ethan whistled. 8 R1 shadow rats emerged from the shadows simultaneously. Not to attack, to distract. 4 rats darted at the viper's feet, not to bite, to dart about, to tangle, to throw off its aim. The viper hissed and lashed its tail, trying to catch at least one. The rats vanished into the shadows and reappeared. The other 4 attacked the elemental, not the elemental itself, but its contractor. They jumped onto his shoulders, onto his head, blocked his view. The man in the mask screamed and started swatting them away. Ethan ran. He's no hero. He's a biologist, and a biologist knows when to retreat. He ran to the basement, slammed the door shut, leaned his back against it. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. The rats returned 3 minutes later, all 8 of them, unharmed. Ethan counted them 3 times. Then he sat down on the floor and closed his eyes. Someone wanted to kill him, or maim him, or scare him. Most likely the Waylands. He had refused them. His creatures were defeating their heirs. He was a threat. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the rats, at the slimes in the jars, at the firefly under the ceiling. He was alive. His creatures were unharmed. He'd gotten lucky this time. Next time, he might not be so lucky. He needed more serious protection. He needed a team that could fight. He needed to stop being the boy with the notebook and start taking the battle lines seriously. He opened his notebook. He started a new page. Project. Ecosystem. Goal. To create an interconnected network of battle lines covering all tactical niches. Reconnaissance. R1 rats. Assault. S1A slimes. Defense. S1B slimes. Infiltration. Julia's R2 rats. Mana suppression. Mira's M1 moth. Fire support. Hana's K1 kumiko. Air superiority. Eleanor's D1 dragon. 7 directions. 7 lines. 1 ecosystem. Not a single wonder creature, but a system, an organism, where each element strengthens the others. He wrote until dawn. In the morning, he told the team about the attack. Mira turned pale. Julia cursed. Hana clenched her fists. Eleanor lowered her head. She knew whose handwriting it was. Ethan said that from that day on, they would work differently. Not just developing individual lines, joint training, coordination. Each of them leads her own familiar, but the familiars must work together as a single organism. He looked at the 4 faces, 4 girls, each with her own pain. Each had come to him because there was nowhere else to go. Now they were a team, not by choice, out of necessity, by fate, by that strange law that brings broken people together so they can piece each other back together. The 6th month became a month of blood. The Wayland clan stopped acting cautiously. At first, there were minor incidents. Someone spilled acid in the hallway outside the basement. Ethan nearly stepped in it. A scout slime spotted the puddle a second before his foot came down. Then, someone planted poisoned bait in the area where the rats lived. 3 rats from the R1 line died. Generation 62. Ethan wrote down their numbers in his notebook, every single one. Then, they came for the farm. The basement was no longer a secret. Too many people knew about it. Students, faculty, clans. Ethan moved the main lines to a new location. So-Yun helped him find an abandoned greenhouse outside the academy grounds. An old building made of stone and glass. Herbs for alchemy classes had once been grown there. Then the alchemy department was shut down, and the greenhouse was abandoned. Ethan moved the jars containing the lines there, along with the containers of rats and the equipment for training Hana the fox cub. It became their new farm. The greenhouse was better than the basement, more space, natural light, and soil for growing the moss the slimes fed on. Ethan divided the space into zones: an acid zone for the slimes, a dark zone for the shadow rats, a warm zone for the fox cub, a work desk for taking notes, a corner with pillows where Mira read. It was his world, his laboratory, his home. The team trained every day. Ethan coordinated. The first joint exercises were a disaster. The slimes didn't understand the rats. The rats were afraid of the fox cub. The fox cub tried to eat the slimes. Mira's butterfly sat on the ceiling and didn't react to anything. Ethan patiently built connections. Scout slimes left chemical markers along the route. The rats learned to read these markers. The fox cub got used to the slime's scent and stopped seeing them as prey. The moth was learning to transmit information not only to Mira, but also to other familiars through visual signals. Week after week, session after session, the system was taking shape. Slowly, with a creak, but it was taking shape. Hana was the best fighter on the team. The 2-tailed fox cub was faster than any C-rank creature. The attacks became precise and devastating. Hana controlled them with her eyes closed. They moved as one. Her bond with her familiar was the strongest on the team. Julia was the best scout. Her R2 line rat could pick any lock. It could see in complete darkness. It could sense traps from 10 meters away. Julia and the rat worked in perfect sync. Julia would twitch her fingers, and the rat would mimic the movement with its claws. They cracked the security department's training safe in 14 seconds. So-Yun never found out about this. It was better that she didn't know. Mira was the information hub. The archivist, Moth, memorized everything. Every book, every scroll, every map. Mira could retrieve any text from the Moth's memory instantly. She had become a living library. If Ethan needed information about a creature, a clan, or a location, Mira would close her eyes for a second and provide the answer. Eleanor would come by at night. She couldn't train with the dragon. The dragon was in the Wayland stables, under guard. But Ethan continued his sessions. Every 3rd night he would sneak into the stables with the help of shadow rats and channel mana into the dragon's wings. The membranes were regenerating, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. The scar tissue was receding. New tissue was growing. Each time, the dragon looked at Ethan with the same expression. Not gratitude, expectation. It was waiting. It knew that one day it would spread its wings again. Toward the end of the 6th month, something happened that shattered Ethan. He came to the greenhouse in the morning and saw smoke. The glass panels were shattered. The stone walls were blackened with soot. Everything inside was burning. Someone had set the farm on fire during the night. Ethan rushed inside. The heat hit him in the face. The smoke choked his lungs. He found the jars. Most of the strains had survived. The acid branch slimes had survived the fire. The rats had hidden in the shadows and waited it out. Mira's moth was in the library. Hannah's fox cub was with Hannah. But the S1 strain, the main one, the very first one, the very slime that started it all. The jar had been sitting on the workbench. The bench had burned up. The jar had burst from the heat. Ethan found it on the floor, a small lump of green jelly, motionless, not pulsating, cooled down. He knelt on the soot-stained floor and stared at what was left of S1. Generation 0 slime. The first. The very first. The one that had wiggled at his feet while the audience laughed. The one that had seeped through the trap during the exam.
The one that had defeated the ice wolf. The one that had been with him from the very first day in this world. The line continued. Hundreds of descendants, thousands, subspecies, branches, an entire population. But this one, the first, the only one who remembered the lecture hall's stone floor and the cold and the laughter, and the moment when Ethan first smiled in this world. It was gone. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't smash the walls. He didn't swear revenge. He sat on the floor, holding the dead slime in his palms, and he was silent. Mira found him an hour later. She stood in the doorway of the ruined greenhouse and looked at him. Then she walked over, sat down next to him, didn't say a word, just sat there. Then Julia came. She stood behind him. She put her hand on his shoulder. Then Hannah. She leaned against the charred wall. She folded her arms. She was silent. Then Eleanor. She knelt down beside him. Her robe was stained with soot. She didn't care. 4 girls and 1 dead slime on the soot-stained floor. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered the fire, another fire, the lab, the autoclave, the petri dishes, the moment the ceiling collapsed. Back then, he'd also been holding what he'd been working on. Back then, he hadn't been able to save it, either. Back then, no one was there. Now, they were. He opened his eyes. He looked at Mira, at Julia, at Hannah, at Eleanor. He placed the dead slime in a jar. He closed the lid. He set it on the surviving shelf. He stood up. He wiped his hands. He opened his notebook. On a blank page, he wrote, Line S1, Generation 0, Status, Loss, Cause, Arson, Perpetrators, Identify. Then he closed the notebook. He looked at the team and said that starting today, everything was changing. He was no longer the boy with the notebook. He was no longer hiding in basements and greenhouses. He was leading the front lines. For real. And those who burned down his farm and killed his first familiar will learn what directed evolution is when it's pursued not for science's sake, but for the sake of an answer. Hannah smiled. Her first hard smile. She said she'd been waiting a long time to hear those words. Ethan didn't smile back. He was calm. That laboratory calm that comes when a scientist stops fearing the result and begins to design it. Ethan worked 7 days straight without stopping. He didn't sleep. He didn't leave his new hideout. Soyeon found him a 3rd location, a stone bunker beneath the arena, an old bomb shelter built during the era of the last clan war. Thick walls, 1 entrance, 3 exits through underground tunnels. Ideal for someone waiting for an attack.
Ethan reconfigured all the lines from scratch. He tallied the losses. The casualties from the fire turned out to be fewer than he'd feared. The main populations had survived. The acid-line slimes had weathered the fire in hibernation mode. They'd curled up into tight balls and hardened. They'd lost half their mass, but preserved their genetic material. The shadow rats had retreated into the shadows and waited it out. He lost 5 out of 40 specimens. Julia's R2 line was safe. The burglar rat was with Julia. Hannah's K1 line was safe too. The fox cub was sleeping in Hannah's room. Mira's moth was sitting in the library. The only irreplaceable loss. S1, Generation 0, the first slime. Ethan forbade himself from thinking about it. Not now. Later, when he had time on the mountain. Now was the time to work. He rebuilt the ecosystem project from scratch. The old version was defensive.
The new one became something else. Ethan developed the S1D line, the Hunter, a slime capable of tracking a specific target by its chemical trail. Every person leaves behind microparticles, sweat, skin cells, and a mana trail. The hunter slime could sense this from a distance of 100 meters. He sent 3 hunters to track the arsonists. 2 days later, the rats reported their findings. The trail led to the West Wing, to the rooms of the Wayland clan's upperclassmen. Ethan wasn't surprised. He made a note of it and continued working. The S1E line, Symbiont. A slime that could envelop a contractor's body in a thin film. Living armor. It absorbed blows, neutralized poisons, healed minor wounds. Ethan tested it on himself. The slime spread across his forearm, a thin layer, almost invisible. He took a knife. He slashed at his arm through the film. The knife slipped. The skin beneath the film remained intact. It works. He made 6 sets, for himself, for Mira, for Julia, for Hannah, Eleanor, and 1 spare. Each of them now carried a symbiotic slime on their body, under their clothes, invisible. The first layer of protection. The R1 line had reached a new level. Generation 120 shadow rats could remain in the shadows for up to a minute. Their range was 30 meters. They had learned to transport objects the size of an apple, and, most importantly, they had learned to communicate with each other in the shadows. A network. Ethan had created a reconnaissance network of 20 rats covering the entire academy. Every corridor, every hall, every room. Information flowed to him through a chain of rats. Who came in? Who went out? Who spoke to whom? Who went where at night? He knew everything. The academy had become transparent to him, and he didn't like what he saw. The Wayland clan was preparing something big. Their senior students were gathering at night in a locked hall. The rats couldn't get inside. The walls were protected by a repelling spell, but they could see who was coming and going. Marcus Wayland, Eleanor's older brother, the clan's heir, 24 years old. His familiar, the golden dragon Aurelius. Marcus had visited the academy 3 times in the past week. That was unusual. He had graduated 2 years ago. He had no business being here. Unless he'd come for Ethan's sake. Eleanor confirmed his fears. She came that night, paler than usual. She said she'd overheard her brother's conversation with their father through the wall. The clan had made a decision. Ethan needed to be removed. Not killed, not yet, but removed from the academy. Discredited, accused of heresy, of violating the laws of bloodline purity. If possible, force him to hand over the recordings to the clan. If not, eliminate him quietly. Eleanor spoke calmly, without emotion. Only her hands gave her away. They were trembling. Ethan nodded. He asked when. Eleanor said that Marcus would challenge him to an official duel.
in the arena, in front of the entire academy, in front of clan representatives. If Ethan refused, it would be considered cowardice, and he would lose his student status. If he accepted and lost, Marcus would have the right to claim his records as a trophy. If he accepted and won, the clan hadn't even considered that possibility. Because Marcus Wayland and Aurelius were one of the strongest pairs on the continent. The Golden Dragon, S-rank, an ancient lineage, 400 years of clan selective breeding against slimes and rats and moths and a two-tailed fox cub.
Ethan sat at the table staring at his notebook. 400 years of selective breeding. He recalled an entry from the Forbidden Archives. Long ago, someone had tried to do the same thing he was doing. Crossbreed. Breed hybrids. And that someone had been erased from history. Ethan opened the journal. He looked at all his lines at once. The big picture. Slimes, rats, moths, fox cubs, dragons. Dozens of subspecies. Hundreds of individuals. Thousands of generations. A year's worth of work. He did the math. If the duel is in a month, he has time. If it's in a week, he doesn't stand a chance. Eleanor said it would be in 3 weeks, the Academy's big tournament. Marcus will appear as a guest of honor. The challenge will look like a gesture from the heir to a great clan condescending to a lowly student. A show. 3 weeks. 21 days. Ethan closed his eyes. He did the math. The S1 slimes could be bred up to generation 600, increase their acidity by 30%. The R1, rats. He could breed a saboteur subspecies, capable not just of hiding in the shadows, but of attacking from the shadows. Hani's fox cub. Can't get a third tail in 3 weeks, but a fourth. No, a third at most. Mira's butterfly. Can be trained to jam mana from a distance, interference, noise in the mana spectrum. The dragon. Not ready, far from ready. Its wings are only 1/3 restored. It won't fly. Ethan opened his eyes. He turned toward the team. They were all there. Mira with a book, Julia on the floor with a rat, Hana by the wall with the fox cub. Eleanor was in the shadows by the door. So-Yun stood a little further away with a cup of tea. Ethan said that in 3 weeks he would be fighting Marcus Wayland and an S-rank golden dragon. He said he needed every one of them. Every familiar, every line, everything they'd been building for the past 6 months. All together, one system, one organism, against a single dragon. Hana smiled, predatorily. She said she'd been waiting for this. Julia cracked her knuckles and said it was finally going to be fun. Mira closed her book and said she was ready. Eleanor raised her head. Her eyes were wet. She said her brother wasn't a bad person, that he believes in what he's doing, that this makes him more terrifying than if he were simply cruel. Ethan nodded. He said he knew. So-Young finished her tea. She said she would draw up all the necessary documents to ensure the duel was conducted by the rules, and that if Ethan lost, she would resign that very day. Because if the world that suppresses talent in the name of purity prevails, then she has no place in this world. Silence. Ethan looked at the 6 faces, at the 6 pairs of eyes. Everyone was looking at him. He nodded. He opened his notebook. He wrote on a blank page, Operation, Ecosystem, Goal, Victory over S-rank, Time frame, 21 days, and beneath that, for S1. The 3 weeks had begun. For 3 weeks, Ethan didn't leave the bunker. Mira brought food 3 times a day, Julia brought information, Hana brought fury, Eleanor brought fear, So-Yun brought tea and documents. Ethan took it all and worked.
He devoted the first week to the slimes. The S1 line had reached generation 580. Its acid spew could pierce steel as thick as a finger. The S1B line had learned to form a wall of 20 individuals. The wall's density could withstand the impact of a battle ram. The S1C had become so small that a single scout slime was impossible to see with the naked eye. But the main achievement of the first week was the S1F line.
Ethan had developed it specifically for a duel. The silencer. A slime that, when sprayed into the air, created a suspension of microparticles that absorbed mana. Any familiar caught in this cloud lost contact with its contractor. For a second. For 2. For 5. That's enough. A dragon without its master's commands is just a big lizard. During the second week, he worked with the team. Every day they spent 2 hours of joint training in the underground tunnels beneath the arena. He set up scenarios. An attack from the right, an attack from above, a retreat, a regrouping, a trap, an ambush, an encirclement. Each of the girls knew her role. Mira, information and mana suppression. By this point, the archivist moth was capable of jamming mana channels at a distance of 15 meters. Not completely, by 30%. But 30% of an S rank is a lot. Julia, infiltration and sabotage. The hacker rat could pick any lock in seconds. But Ethan had taught her a few new things. The rat could now carry a jammer slime on her back and release it at the desired location. A living bomb. Silent, invisible, deadly. Kana, firepower. The two-tailed fox cub was stronger than most B-rank creatures. The third tail was close. The log showed that the transition point was a few days away. Ethan channeled mana into it every night. He stimulated it. He nudged it along. Rushing evolution is dangerous, but he had no choice. Eleanor. Her role was the most difficult. She couldn't deploy the dragon. The dragon was in the clan's stables. Its wings were 40% healed. It wouldn't fly. But Eleanor could do something else. She knew Marcus, knew his tactics, his habits, his weaknesses. She had spent 10 hours with Ethan analyzing every one of Marcus's battles over the past 3 years. Aurelius attacks in 3 ways. Fire breath, straight line, range 40 meters, angle 30 degrees, tail strike, radius 5 meters, enough force to split a stone wall. Wing pressure. When Aurelius spread his wings, the airflow would knock someone off their feet from a distance of 10 meters. 3 attacks, 3 responses. Ethan planned each one. By the 3rd week, he had stopped sleeping altogether. He sat at the table and calculated, double-checked, simulated scenarios in his head. He broke down every round into seconds. If Aurelius attacks with fire in the first 3 seconds, the shield slimes form a wall. The wall holds for 5 seconds. During that time, Julia releases the rat with the silencer. The rat moves through the shadows to a spot behind the dragon's back. The silencer disperses. The connection between Marcus and Aurelius is cut off for 2 seconds. Hana attacks through the opening. 2 tails, a double fire strike. Aurelius is distracted. The slime come in from below. They cling to its paws. Acid, not to kill, to slow it down. Mira's moth jams Marcus's mana channel by 30%. Marcus can't re-establish the connection quickly. Aurelius loses his coordination. Ethan had written down every scenario, every possibility, every backup plan. 17 scenarios, 34 subvariants, 6 retreat plans. Mira asked him at night, quietly, while the others slept in the bunker. She asked if he was afraid. Ethan thought about it. He replied that he was afraid, but not of losing. Losing is just data. You can learn from defeat and try again. He's afraid that one of them will get hurt. Mira, Hana, Julia, Eleanor.
He's afraid that they're standing by his side because they believe in him.
And he's just a dead grad student with a notebook.
Mira was silent. Then she took his hand. Her fingers were smudged with ink, as always. She said he wasn't a dead grad student, that a dead grad student doesn't cry over a slime, that a dead grad student doesn't sit for 6 hours drawing a tree of evolution for someone else's little fox because a girl with a straight back was crying on the balcony, that a dead grad student doesn't go every night to see the chained dragon because another girl asked for help. She said he was the most alive person she'd ever met, and that's exactly why they're all here. Ethan looked at her, at the ink stains, at the moth sleeping on her hair, at the book within reach. He wanted to say something. He couldn't. He just squeezed her hand. Mira smiled. That was enough. 2 days before the duel, Hana's fox cub grew a third tail. Hana stood in the center of the training hall. The fox cub stood before her. Its 3 tails blazed with golden fire. The heat filled the entire room. The slimes on the walls hissed. The rats hid in the shadows. Mira's moth fluttered up to the ceiling. Hana stood in the center of the fire and didn't burn.
The contractual bond between her and the fox cub pulsed so strongly that Ethan could see it without the journal. A golden thread from heart to heart. Hana turned to Ethan. Her face was wet, not from tears, from the heat. Or maybe from tears. She didn't hide it. She said 2 words. "Third tail." Ethan nodded. He wrote it down in his notebook. Line K-1. Third tail. Success. Time until the duel? 48 hours. The day before the duel, Ethan sat alone in the bunker. Everyone had gone to sleep. Everyone except him. He looked at the notebook, at hundreds of pages, at the lines, the branches, and the generations, at the names, S1, R1, M1, K1, D1. Then he flipped the page back to the very first one, the one he'd written on his first night in this world. Line S1, common slime. Objective, increase acid resistance and division capacity. He ran his finger along the lines, then he closed the notebook. He stood up. He walked over to the shelf. He took a jar. Inside the jar lay a dead slime, small, green, motionless. Ethan set the jar on the table, next to the notebook. He said quietly, "Tomorrow, for you." The day of the duel began with rain. Heavy gray clouds hung low over the academy. Raindrops pounded against the stone walls. The arena glistened with water. The stands had been filling up since early morning. A typical tournament would draw a couple hundred spectators. Today, everyone had come. Students from every class, faculty from every department, representatives from 6 of the 7 great clans. Word of the duel between the Wayland Heir and the Trash Summoner had spread throughout Airhold. Ethan stood in the underground corridor beneath the arena. Everyone was nearby. Mira held a moth in the palm of her hand. The moth's wings had turned dark blue with silver. Julia crouched down. A rat burglar sat on her shoulder. A pea-sized slime silencer was attached to the rat's back. Hana stood upright. The fox cub's 3 tails were wrapped around her legs. Its golden fur glowed in the dim light. Eleanor was pale. She had come without her clan's robe, without the crest, without the golden dragon on a black field, just in a white shirt. She had chosen a side. So-Yun stood a little way off, a cup of tea in her hands. Her face was calm. Only her fingers on the cup were white with tension. Ethan looked at each of them. Then he said one word. "Let's begin." He climbed the steps into the arena. Rain lashed his face. The stands roared.
Thousands of faces, thousands of eyes. Everyone was watching him. He was wearing a simple shirt, no robe, no weapons, a notebook tucked under his arm. From the other side of the arena, Marcus Wayland stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, a black robe with a golden dragon on the back, a handsome face, a confident smile. He moved like a man who had never lost a single time in his life, because he had never lost a single time. Behind him walked Aurelius, the golden dragon. Ethan had seen dragons before, Eleanor's young dragon in the dark stable, pictures in books. Nothing had prepared him for this. Aurelius was enormous, 6 meters from nose to tail, a wingspan of 12 meters. Scales the color of molten gold, each scale the size of a palm. Eyes red as coals, smoke billowed from his nostrils. Not fire, smoke. The dragon didn't even deem it necessary to breathe fire. Not yet. The stands roared at the sight of Aurelius. Some chanted Marcus's name, some whistled. Some were already placing bets. The master judge stepped into the center of the arena. He read the rules aloud.
A duel until one side surrendered. Intentional killing of the contractor was prohibited. Familiars were not protected by this rule. Everything else was permitted. Marcus looked at Ethan across the arena. He spoke loudly so the stands could hear. He asked if Reyes had come to surrender. Ethan didn't answer him. He opened his notebook, placed his hand on the ground, and began. They all came out at once, from beneath the arena, from cracks in the stone, from the shadows beneath the stands, from the drainage channels, from everywhere. The slimes appeared first, not just one, not 10, 150. A green wave surged from beneath the ground. Swun slimes, assault units, 50 specimens, green, dense, acidic. Swun B slimes, shields, 30 specimens. They closed ranks into a wall in front of Ethan, a living bastion chest high. Swun C slimes, scouts, 20, transparent, invisible. They spread out across the arena. Swun D slimes, hunters, 10, crawling along the ground following Marcus's trail. Swun E slimes, symbiotes, 6, attached to Ethan and the team's bodies, living armor. Swun F slimes, silencers, 20, spread out along the perimeter, ready to disperse. Then the rats. One line, shadow rats, 25. They emerged from the shadows between the arena's stones. Gray shadows glided across the wet stone and vanished again. They were impossible to see. You could only sense them. Then Julia emerged from the side entrance, a burglar rat on her shoulder. She stood to Ethan's left. Then Mira. The moth spread its wings and took flight. Dark blue wings with silver veins. It hovered over the arena and began to radiate. A quiet mana hum. Interference. A tingling in the air. Then Hana. She was the last to emerge. The fox cub walked beside her. Its 3 tails fanned out. Its golden fur glowed even in the rain. Raindrops evaporated before they could touch its fur. Heat surrounded the fox cub like a halo. The stands fell silent. Not out of fear. It was because they couldn't understand what they were seeing. These were F-rank creatures, slimes, rats, a moth, a single fox with 3 tails. Trash, according to this world's classification. But there were many of them, and they were everywhere, and they moved as a single organism. Marcus stopped smiling. He looked at the army of trash creatures and, for the first time in his life, didn't know what to do. Then he made up his mind. Aurelius. Fire. The golden dragon opened its jaws. Ethan had been waiting for this. Scenario 1. Fire breath. Range 40 meters. Angle 30 degrees. 3 seconds until impact. The wall. 30 slime shields closed ranks to form a barrier.
The fire struck. A golden flame. The heat was so intense that the arena's stones began to melt. The wall of slimes took the hit. The front row vaporized. The second row melted. The third row held. 5 seconds. The fire stopped. The wall was smoking. 10 slimes were lost. 20 remained. They regrouped. They closed the gaps. 5 seconds. Enough. Julia. The rat slipped into the shadows. She glided along the walls of the arena behind the dragon. The silencer on her back detached. The slime sprayed out. A cloud of microparticles enveloped Aurelius from behind. The dragon flinched. He turned his head. His eyes lost focus. The connection with Marcus was severed. Marcus flinched. He clutched his chest. The mana channel between him and the dragon choked off. Interference from the moth. A cloud of suppressor. A double blow to the connection. 2 seconds. Game over. The fox cub leaped. 3 tails flared. A triple fiery strike. Not at the dragon. Into the ground beneath the dragon. The rock exploded. Aurelius lost his footing. His right paw sank into the molten pit. The dragon collapsed onto its side. Hunter slimes. 10 of them rushed toward the dragon. They clung to its wings. Not acid. Glue. Ethan had bred a sticky subspecies over the past week. Line S1G. Improvisation. Aurelius's wings were glued together. The dragon lurched. He spread his wings. The slimes stretched but didn't tear away. They were pulling the wings down. Not hard, just enough so the dragon couldn't generate lift. The third attack was neutralized. Marcus reestablished communication. 6 seconds had passed. He wasn't used to losing control. His face was pale. He shouted a command. Aurelius lashed out with his tail, a 5-meter radius. The shield slimes took the blow. They scattered. 15 were destroyed. But in those few seconds, the shadow rats had done their job. 25 rats emerged from the shadows simultaneously. Beneath Aurelius, around Marcus, in the stands, everywhere. Each rat carried a silencer slime on its back. 25 spray points. A cloud engulfed the entire arena. Mana links throughout the arena choked, not just Marcus's. The familiars of the spectators in the front rows whimpered and hid. The judge retreated. Marcus stood in the center of the mana noise, blind and deaf. His dragon lay on its side with its wings bound, one paw in a molten pit. The fox cub's 3 tails glowed gold all around. A moth above his head drowned out the last remnants of the connection. Rats surrounded Marcus in a living ring. Slimes clung to the dragon from all sides. Not acid, not poison, just weight. 100 slimes on the dragon's body. Aurelius could have shaken them off. He could have stood up. He could have burned the entire arena to the ground. But to do that, he needed a command from his master. And his master stood in a cloud of interference and couldn't break through the mana noise. Ethan stood behind a wall of slimes, a notebook in his hand. Rain streamed down his face. He looked at Marcus, then at the stands, at the thousands of faces, at the clan representatives, at the teachers, at the students. He began to speak, softly. But the arena was as quiet as a grave, and every word reached all the way to the back row. He said that for 300 years they had kept their creatures in cages because they were afraid. They were afraid that if they gave them freedom, they would become something they couldn't control. He told them to look. This is what they're becoming. This isn't trash. This is what they could always have been. It's just that no one had ever given them that chance. He turned to Marcus, told him to take his dragon and leave. Said he didn't want to kill it, that the dragon wasn't to blame for having been raised in a golden cage. Marcus stood there. He looked at Ethan, at his own hands, at Aurelius on the ground. For the first time in his life, he was at a loss for words. 1 second. 2. 3. He raised his hand. He surrendered. After the duel, Ethan's world split in two. Half the academy sided with him. Students from the lesser clans, scholarly students without lineage, teachers who had remained silent for years. They came to him, one after another. They asked him to teach them. They asked him to show them. They begged him to explain. The other half wanted to destroy him. The great clans saw the duel not as a victory of talent, but as a threat to the order.
If a trash summoner defeats the heir to the Wayland clan, then the entire ranking system is called into question. It would mean that centuries of clan selection had been a mistake. It would mean that their dragons, griffins, and basilisks were worth less than they thought. They could not allow that to happen. The Council of Clans convened a week after the duel. Ethan wasn't invited. So-yun told him about the decision. The Wayland clan, with the support of 3 other great clans, demanded that Ethan's records be handed over to the Academy for examination. Formally, this was an investigation into heresy. Crossbreeding creatures of different classes has been forbidden for 300 years. If evidence is found in the records, Ethan will be expelled. His creatures will be destroyed. His contractors will have their licenses revoked. Ethan listened in silence. Then he asked how much time he had. So-yun said a month. The expert commission would convene in a month. Until then, his records were safe. A month. Ethan nodded. A month was a long time. Many generations. A lot of work. He wasn't going to hide. He wasn't going to run away. He was going to do what he'd always done. Work. First things first, he took on apprentices. Not many, 7 of them. Young summoners with trashy registries. One had a bug, another had a lizard, a third had moss. Moss. A living F- ranked moss. A girl named Wren stood before him with a pot of moss and red eyes, saying that everyone was laughing at her, that moss wasn't even a creature, it was just a plant, and why on earth should she even be a summoner? Ethan looked at the moss through the journal. He saw a tree of possibilities, 28 branches. One of them led to a form called living cover. Moss, capable of growing on any surface, creating a protective barrier, absorbing toxins from the air, healing wounds upon contact with the skin. Ethan showed Wren the branch. Wren stopped crying. She began to take notes. He taught them just as So-yun had once taught her students, calmly, patiently, without condescension. To each one, he showed the tree of possibilities for their creature. To each one, he explained the principles. He didn't give ready-made answers. He taught them to see. He taught them to think. He taught them to ask the right questions. It wasn't about what rank my being held. It was about what conditions were needed for it to become what it could be. Lin Jiao appeared at the 3rd class, small, disheveled, with a notebook thicker than her arm. She wasn't a student. She was a 16-year-old genius in theoretical mana who had enrolled in the academy 2 years early. She listened to his lecture for the students. Then she approached him. She said that his model of evolution through mana pressure was mathematically incorrect, that he was using a linear function where an exponential one was needed, that his estimates of the time frames were 20% too low because he wasn't accounting for the cumulative effect of mana saturation in the 3rd and 4th generations. Ethan looked at her. He looked at her notebook. The notebook was filled with equations. He read the first page, then the second, then the 3rd. She was right. His model was crude, intuitive. He sensed the correct answers, but couldn't prove them mathematically. She could. He said she was right. Lin froze. She opened her mouth, then closed it. No one had ever told her she was right before. Everyone had said she was too small,
too young, that it was too early for her.
That she didn't understand. Ethan said he needed a partner, not a student, a partner. Someone who would calculate what he sensed intuitively, someone who would translate his notes into the language of mathematics. Lynn looked at him. Then she nodded, quickly, too quickly, as if she were afraid he'd change his mind. From that day on, she was part of the team. Number 7, the youngest, the quietest, and the most important. Because within the first week, Lynn had recalculated all his models and found what he'd missed: the cumulative effect. His lines were evolving faster than he'd thought. The slimes weren't 400th generation in terms of efficiency. They were 600th. Little Lynn, with her disheveled hair and a notebook full of equations, showed him that he had underestimated his own work. Ethan looked at her calculations, then at his own lines, then back at the calculations. And for the first time in this world, he laughed. Not a smirk, a laugh. Lynn flinched. Then she smiled, carefully. Work on Eleanor's dragon was proceeding in parallel. The wings had regenerated 60%. For the first time in years, the dragon spread them fully. The membranes were still thin, still weak, but they were there, intact, without scars. Eleanor came to the stall every night. She sat down next to the dragon. She rested her head on his neck. And she spoke quietly to him. Ethan heard her sometimes. She said it would be soon. Soon he would fly, and she would fly with him, and they would never return to the cage. Ethan stood in the hallway, listening, and felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't make weapons. He made a response to a specific person's specific pain. A butterfly for Mira, so she would believe she was smart. A fox cub for Hannah, so she would stop bringing shame upon the clan. A rat for Julia, so she would have something of her own. A dragon for Eleanor, so it could fly again. And new designs for the students, so the moss would become a canopy, the beetle a guardian, and the lizard something that didn't yet have a name. He wasn't building an army. He was responding to pain. It was just that there were more and more responses. At the end of the month, the day before the expert commission, something happened that changed everything. Ethan was in the greenhouse, the new greenhouse. So-Yun had helped restore the old one and reinforce the walls. He was checking the lines when the shadow rats sent the signal. Not an ordinary one, but a top-level alert. All 20 rats in the reconnaissance network at once. Ethan went outside. To the east, the sky split open. Not lightning, not a thunderstorm. A crack. A black, jagged line stretching from the ground to the clouds. The air around the crack vibrated. A chill crept out of the crack. Not a physical one, something else. The kind of chill that makes familiars whimper and hide. The kind of chill that sends dragons into hibernation. The void rift. Ethan stood and watched. The rift was widening. Creatures began to emerge from it. Black, eyeless, rankless, fearless. Void creatures. And they were heading toward the academy. The void creatures walked in silence. No roars, no pounding of hooves. Only silence, which was worse than any sound. The academy descended into chaos within minutes. Familiars were going mad. D-rank wolves huddled under benches and whimpered. C-rank griffins thrashed about in their stalls and refused to come out. Darius Quan's ice wolf lay on its side and closed its eyes. Even Aurelius, the S-rank golden dragon, the pride of the Wyland clan, he curled up in a corner of his stall and didn't respond to Marcus's commands. Marcus screamed. He pounded his fist against the dragon's scales. Aurelius didn't move. Ethan saw everything through the rats, and he saw what no one else saw. The void creatures didn't attack just anyone. They were heading for specific targets. Toward the stalls.
toward familiars with ancient bloodlines. The purer the bloodline, the faster the creature moved toward it. The more ancient the lineage, the hungrier the eyeless eyes were. They fed on lineage. The purity of the blood was their sustenance. Ethan stood on the academy wall and watched the approaching wave. Black figures against the backdrop of a torn sky. 10, 20, 50. They weren't moving fast, nor were they moving slow. Inevitable. And then he noticed. His creatures weren't afraid. The slimes on the wall pulsed calmly. The shadow rats sat on the stones and watched the creatures without panic. Mira's moth hovered in the air and flickered with an even light. Hana's fox cub stood next to its mistress, and its 3 tails glowed with an even. Not a single one of Ethan's familiars was afraid. Not a single one. The void creatures passed by the wall, past the slimes, past the rats, as if they weren't there, as if they were invisible. No, not invisible. Inedible. Ethan understood. It hit him like a blow to the chest, like a flash, like the moment when the result of an experiment finally matches the hypothesis. His creatures were hybrids, mixed, impure by this world's standards, without a pure lineage, without an ancient bloodline, without centuries of inbreeding. And the creatures of the void didn't eat them, not because they couldn't, because they didn't want to. A pure lineage was food to the void. An impure hybrid bloodline was poison to the void. An antibody. For 300 years, the world had cultivated blood purity and turned its elite into the perfect food for whatever had come to devour everything pure. And Ethan had accidentally developed the only biological defense. He ran toward So-young. He found her at the main gate. She was trying to organize the evacuation of the students. Ethan told her 3 sentences. The void creatures eat pure bloodlines. My hybrids are poison to them. I need the arena and all my creatures. So-young looked at him. 1 second. She nodded. She ran toward the masters. Ethan ran toward the bunker. The team was assembled. Mira, Julia, Hana, Eleanor, Lynn, all the students, all the familiars. Ethan spoke quickly. He explained what he'd figured out. The void fears hybrids. Their creatures are a shield, the only shield. We need to deploy the creatures to the perimeter. Slimes on the walls, rats in the shadows around the stalls, a moth over the arena to suppress mana, a fox cub to the front lines, the students with their familiars to the flanks. Every trash creature is a weapon against the void. Hana didn't ask a single question. She took the fox cub and walked toward the wall. Julia smirked and said she'd always known that trash had saved the world. She grabbed the rat and dived into the shadows. Mira kissed the moth on her palm and released it. Dark blue wings spread out over the arena. Lynn ran toward the students, to give orders, to count, to coordinate. Eleanor stood motionless. She was looking toward the stalls. Ethan understood. D-Dragon. Aurelius lay in the stall, paralyzed with fear. But Eleanor's dragon was there too, a young dragon with its wings 60% restored, a purebred Wayland dragon, perfect food for the void. Eleanor ran toward the stalls. Ethan ran after her. They burst into the stalls at the same time. Aurelius lay in the corner, huge, pitiful. Marcus sat next to him on the floor. His face was gray. His eyes were empty. He looked at Ethan and Eleanor. There was no hatred in his gaze, only confusion. He said that Aurelius wouldn't get up, that the bond was there, but the dragon wasn't responding, that all he could sense through the bond was fear, pure, animal fear. 400 years of clan breeding, S-rank, a legendary lineage, and this dragon was lying on the floor, afraid, because he was too pure, too tasty, and he could sense it. Eleanor walked past Marcus to the neighboring stall. Her dragon was standing, not lying down, standing. Trembling, but standing. His wings were spread, not fully, 60%. Thin membranes, new tissue, no scars. Eleanor pressed herself against his neck. The dragon was trembling. She whispered something to him. Ethan couldn't hear what. Then she turned, looked at Ethan, said that his dragon was also a pureblood, that the void would come for him, too. Ethan nodded. He'd already been thinking about that. He walked over to Eleanor's dragon. He placed his hand on its scales. He opened the journal. The Tree of Possibilities. A living branch. Free-winged. 60% wing regeneration. Not enough to fly. But Ethan saw something else. Next to the free-winged branch, a new branch. One that hadn't been there before. It glowed a strange color. Not gold, not blue. Silver. The branch was called hybrid-winged. Ethan froze. The dragon program wasn't a typical breeding program. He was infusing the dragon with tainted mana, tainted by contact with slimes, rats, and a moth. His mana was contaminated with hybridity. Every time he healed the dragon's wings, he introduced into its bloodline what the clans considered filth. Accidentally. Not on purpose. But the journal saw the result. Eleanor's dragon was no longer purebred. It was a hybrid. The first hybrid dragon in the history of Airhold. And the void would not touch it. Ethan turned to Eleanor. He told her that her dragon was safe. He explained why. Eleanor listened. Her eyes widened. Then she looked at Marcus. Marcus was sitting on the floor next to Aurelius and had heard every word. His expression shifted. Pride, anger, denial, understanding, fear. Ethan walked over to him. He said he could help. He could begin the process of hybridizing Aurelius, introduce an impurity, taint his bloodline, make him unpalatable to the void. But that would mean the end of the pure Wayland line. 400 years. Marcus looked at him, then at Aurelius. The dragon lay on his side, trembling, whimpering. The great S-rank golden dragon whimpered like a puppy. Marcus closed his eyes, opened them, nodded. Ethan placed his hand on Aurelius's scales, the golden scales of a 400-year-old bloodline, and he began to infuse it with impure mana. Ethan worked all night. Aurelius took the impure mana with difficulty. The golden scales dimmed. They changed. Gold mingled with silver, with green, with dark blue. The colors of his creatures. The colors of hybridity. Marcus sat nearby and watched in silence as 400 years of pure blood dissolved into something new. As morning approached, Aurelius opened his eyes. He raised his head. The trembling stopped. The fear was gone. The dragon looked at Marcus, and Marcus sensed through their bond something he had never felt before. Not obedience, not submission. Calm. Aurelius was calm. For the first time in 400 years of the incident, the dragon was not afraid. Outside, the void creatures had reached the walls. The slimes on the walls were the first to meet them. The black figures touched the green mass and recoiled, as if burned. The slimes were poison. The creatures retreated from the wall. They went around it. They found a patch without slimes. They climbed up. Shadow rats struck from the shadows. 10 rats for every creature. They didn't bite. They clung to them. They carried slime silencers on their backs. Microparticles settled on the black bodies. The creatures froze. They writhed. They retreated. The hybrid mana burned them like acid. Kana stood on the wall with the fox cub. 3 tails were ablaze. A creature scrambled up the wall right in front of her. A black, eyeless head appeared over the edge. Hana didn't flinch. The fox cub leaped. 3 tails struck simultaneously. Fire mixed with hybrid mana. The creature burst into flames, not ordinary flames, but silvery ones. It disintegrated, scattering into black ash. The stands, which served as an observation point, gasped. The first creature destroyed. Julia was working below.
The rat burglar was prying open the sewer grates through which the creatures were trying to burrow under the walls. Slimes were flooding the passageways. A living plug. The creatures ran into the wall of poison and retreated. Mira stood on the tower. A moth above her spread its wings wide. Silver veins glowed. It was transmitting information to all of Ethan's familiars simultaneously. A living communication network. Every slime knew where every rat was. Every rat knew where every creature was. Coordination. System. Ecosystem. Lynn ran between positions with a notepad. She counted. She made adjustments. She shouted to the students where to move their familiars. Her moss cover, Wren, had spread across the western wall, and the creatures gave it a wide berth. Tom's beetles stood at the gate and wouldn't let the creatures through the main entrance. Kai's lizard spat hybrid acid from the roof. Trash creatures, F rank, below F rank, the ones that weren't even listed in the registries. They stood on the academy's walls and defended the world that laughed at them. The battle lasted until noon. The creatures came in waves. First wave, 20 creatures, repelled by slimes and rats. Casualties, 30 slimes, 5 rats. Second wave, 40 creatures. Hana burned 12. Julia blocked the underground passages. Lynn redirected the students to the flanks. Casualties, 60 slimes, 10 rats, and 1 of Tom's beetles. Tom stood over the dead beetle, motionless. Ethan approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. Tom nodded. He picked up the beetle, carried it to the wall, returned to the ranks. The third wave, 60 creatures. Ethan realized he couldn't hold them back. There were fewer than 100 slimes left. The rats were tired. Mira's moth was beginning to fade. Hana's fox cub was gasping for breath. The 3 tails were glowing more dimly. Ethan stood on the wall and watched the black wave. He counted. 60 creatures, 100 slimes, 15 rats, 1 fox cub, 1 moth, 7 students with trash familiars. Not enough. He closed his eyes. He thought about S1, about the first slime, about the stone floor of the lecture hall, about the laughter, about the notebooks stolen from the kitchen, about the petri dishes in the burning lab, about the 20 generations he'd fallen short of. He opened his eyes. A roar. Over the academy, from above. Everyone looked up. A dragon. Not Aurelius, Eleanor's dragon. It was flying, wings spread wide, not 60%. Fully. The thin membranes stretched taut, new tissue, not a single scar. Eleanor was sitting on its back. Her hair was blowing in the wind. No cloak, no coat of arms. Just a girl on a dragon flying for the first time in her life. The dragon roared, not out of fear, out of delight, out of freedom. 18 years in a cage, clipped wings, a dark stable, and now he was flying. The world beneath him, the sky above him, and he was free. Eleanor steered him downward, toward the third wave. The dragon opened its jaws. Fire. Not golden like Aurelius's. Silvery. Hybrid. The fire swept through the ranks of the creatures. They flared up and crumbled. 10, 20, 30. The silvery flame burned a void out of the air. The dragon made a second pass, a third. The creatures retreated. For the first time during the entire attack, they were running. Not from the golden S rank, from the hybrid, from the trash.
from a creature of tainted lineage that flew above them, roaring with joy. Then Aurelius emerged from the stall. His scales had changed, gold with silver and green veins,
Hybrid scales. Marcus was sitting on his back. His face was pale. His hands were clenched. But he was flying. Aurelius rose into the air and positioned himself beside Eleanor's dragon. 2 dragons, brother and sister on dragons. A pure-blood turned hybrid, and a hybrid set free. They struck together, a double silver flame. The third wave ceased to exist. The void rift in the east trembled. It appeared. It closed. The black fissure in the sky healed like a wound. Silence. Ethan stood on the wall, a notebook in his hand. The remains of the creatures smoldered all around. The slimes were slowly gathering into groups. Rats emerged from the shadows. Mira's moth landed on her palm and folded its wings. Hana's fox cub lay down at her feet. Its 3 tails went still. Hana sat down next to him and placed her hand on his head. The dragons landed in the academy courtyard. Eleanor slid off the dragon's back. Her legs gave way. Marcus caught her. Brother and sister stood facing each other. Marcus looked at her, then at her dragon, at its wings, intact, free. He didn't say a word. He lowered his head. Eleanor took his hand. So-yeon stood by the gate, a cup of tea in her hands. The tea had long since gone cold. She looked at the arena, at the walls, at the trash creatures that had saved the academy, at the 2 dragons with hybrid scales. She was smiling, for the first time since Ethan had arrived. Lynn ran up to him with a notebook. She spoke quickly. That the data was incredible. That hybrid mana creates an antibody against the void. That this could be scaled up. That if hybridization were introduced into all bloodlines, the void would never again be able to feed on familiars. That the rank system wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. It made the world vulnerable. Ethan listened and nodded. He'd known this from day one. From the moment he saw the trash slime's tree of possibilities. Purity is a dead end. Diversity is life. That was the principle of evolution. That was the principle of his old laboratory, and that was the principle that saved the world. That evening, he sat in the greenhouse, alone, for the first time in a long time. A notebook lay on the table. A jar containing a dead S1 stood nearby. He looked at the jar. A small green lump. The first slime. The first familiar. The first experiment in the new world. He said quietly, "We did it." Then he heard footsteps, not just one pair, several. Mira entered first, carrying a tray with food and tea. Behind her was Julia. She collapsed onto the pillows in the corner. The rat curled up on her stomach. Behind her was Hana. She leaned against the wall. The fox cub rested its head on her lap. 3 tails dangled down to the floor. Behind her was Eleanor. Quiet, with red eyes. With a smile Ethan had never seen before. Behind her was Lynn, with a notebook, as always. So-yeon came in last, with a cup of tea. Fresh, hot. She set it down in front of Ethan. She said one word. Stay. Ethan looked at them. 6 faces, 6 pairs of eyes. Mira with ink-stained fingers. Julia with quick eyes. Hana with a straight back. Eleanor with empty eyes that were no longer empty. Lynn with a notebook. So-yeon with tea. He remembered the lab. Empty, dark, the hum of the centrifuge. Silence. Night after night, alone. He died alone, and his last thought was of bacteria, not people. Now he was sitting in the greenhouse. People were all around him, Creatures were all around him. Slimes pulsed in their jars. Rats rustled in the corners. A moth fluttered on the ceiling. A fox cub dozed. Somewhere behind the wall, 2 dragons slept side by side. One, a former pureblood. One, a former captive. Both free. Both hybrids. Both alive. Ethan picked up his cup. He took a sip. The tea was hot and bitter. So-Yun always brewed it too strong. He looked at the notebook, at the hundreds of pages, at the lines and branches and generations. Thousands of creatures, tens of thousands of generations. A year's work. 1 year. He thought about what would happen next. The expert commission. The clans. Fault lines that might open again. The one who opens them. A conspiracy. The secret of the transfer. Someone had summoned him to this world. Someone who had died 20 years ago. Whose final spell hung in the cosmos, waiting. Waiting for the one who knew how to guide directed evolution. Waiting for him. There was a lot of work ahead. Years of work. But today, he was simply sitting in a warm greenhouse with people who had come to him because they wanted to be near him. Not because he was strong, not because he was useful, because he was the one who saw a tree with 40 branches in a pile of slime. The one who saw 9 tails in a single tail. The one who saw flight in clipped wings. The one who sees in every broken creature and every broken person what they could be, and who spares no nights to make that a reality. Mira sat down next to him. She rested her head on his shoulder. A moth fluttered onto his hair. Ethan didn't pull away. Hannah snorted from her corner, but not out of malice. Julia whistled. Eleanor smiled. Lynn buried her face in her notebook and blushed. So-Yun sipped her tea and watched them with the expression of someone who was finally seeing what they'd believed in their whole life. Ethan closed his eyes. In his past life, he'd died alone in a burning laboratory, and his last thought had been of bacteria. In this life, he was sitting in a warm room surrounded by people, and his last thought before he fell asleep right at the table, just as he had done hundreds of times before, was not about lines, nor about generations, nor about evolution. It was simple. Finally, he would wake up in the morning. Mira would be there. The notebook would be on the table. The creatures would be waiting. And he would begin a new day. Not alone. Never alone again.